Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so today we're diving deep into a topic you clearly want to understand better.
Yeah.
The U.S. involvement in Vietnam. We've got this great podcast lecture you've sent over. Seems perfect for a solid overview, but together we're going to extract those key insights
Right.
that'll really make this complex history click for you.
Yeah, it's a fascinating period. So many factors at play. The lecture breaks down the reasons for U.S. involvement into 6 clear categories.
Oh, okay.
Which is a helpful framework, I think, for our discussion.
6 categories.
Okay.
That's a lot to unpack. We'll tackle them one by one.
Yeah.
Make sure you walk away with a clear understanding of each piece of the puzzle. First up is ideology. And here we've got to consider the Cold War context, right? This whole clash between capitalism and communism with the U.S. feeling this almost moral obligation to contain its spread.
Absolutely. And the lecture really highlights Eisenhower's Domino Theory. This idea that if one nation falls to communism, others will follow, like a chain reaction. Vietnam was seen as that first domino, teetering on the edge. Imagine the pressure on U.S. leadership at the time.
It's almost like a global game of chess.
Yeah.
With each move carrying these incredibly high stakes. And then you have Kennedy coming in, and as the lecture mentions, his approach was counterinsurgency. It almost sounds like a medical term, right?
It does.
Trying to contain an outbreak before it spreads.
Yeah, it's a very different strategy compared to just outright military force. Kennedy was trying to address the root causes, the political and social conditions that made countries vulnerable to communism.
Okay, so next we move on to domestic politics.
Yeah.
Which the lecture points out were just as heated as the international scene. This was the era of the Red Scare and the U.S. Senator McCarthy. And this immense pressure on leaders to be tough on communism. Almost like any sign of weakness could be political suicide.
Yeah. Eisenhower's own party, the Republicans, were terrified of appearing soft on communism. They felt it would cost them elections. And that political reality absolutely shaped foreign policy decisions.
Wow. So we've got this fear of communism both at home and abroad. The lecture mentions Kennedy needing a win after the Bay of Pigs fiasco in Cuba. Makes you wonder if Vietnam became his chance to prove himself on the world stage. It seems incredibly risky, though, doesn't it?
It does. And then you have Johnson, who, as the lecture points out, carried this deep fear of being the first president to lose a war.
Right.
That personal stake adds a whole other layer to his decision-making.
It's amazing how much individual personalities and fears can shape the course of history. Now on to economic interests. The lecture doesn't dwell on this as much as the ideological aspects, but it was definitely a factor.
Absolutely. Eisenhower saw Southeast Asia as vital for U.S. economic interests. Trade, resources, access to markets, all of that was at stake. Protecting those interests was part of the equation from the beginning.
It's interesting how the lecture then talks about Kennedy's approach to nation-building in South Vietnam. Not just military aid, but economic assistance, too. Was this genuine or simply another tactic in the anti-communist playbook? It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah, and under Johnson, the war's costs started becoming a major point of debate back home. Billions of dollars were being poured into the conflict, and that economic reality couldn't be ignored, even if it wasn't the initial driving force.
All right, let's move on to international credibility, which the lecture argues was a huge consideration for the U.S. This idea that losing Vietnam would make them appear weak on the world stage.
This was about more than just appearances. It was about the Soviet Union, the other superpower in the Cold War. The U.S. needed to demonstrate its commitment to containing communism and reassuring its allies around the world.
The lecture makes an interesting comparison between the Vietnam War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Did Kennedy view Vietnam as another test of strength after successfully navigating the Cuban situation? Food for thought for sure.
And the lecture highlights how Johnson, maybe even more so than the others, fixated on global perceptions of the U.S. It seems this concern played a significant role in his decisions.
Next up, we have assistance for allies, which seems straightforward on the surface. The U.S. saw South Vietnam as a key ally in the fight against communism.
But it's crucial to remember that alliances involve more than just shared ideologies. It's about loyalty, standing by your partners, even when things get complicated.
And things definitely got complicated in Vietnam. The lecture points out how Eisenhower supported Ngo Dinh Diem, the leader of South Vietnam, even though he was an authoritarian figure. It shows how messy real-world alliances can be.
It's a classic example of realpolitik, and Kennedy continued that support, even with doubts about Diem. Was it loyalty, strategy, or a mix of both? It's hard to disentangle those motives.
The lecture also suggests Johnson's escalation was partly about ensuring South Vietnam's survival.
Yeah.
But was it really that simple? I think that question deserves further exploration.
I agree. There were clearly multiple factors driving Johnson's decisions, and it's unlikely any single explanation captures the full complexity. Now, the final category from the lecture is the Quagmire Theory.
Okay.
This idea that U.S. involvement wasn't a single decisive act, but rather a gradual slide into a messy and intractable situation.
Like getting stuck in quicksand.
Yeah.
The more you struggle, the deeper you sink.
Yeah. The lecture points out that Eisenhower, having experienced World War II firsthand, was hesitant about committing ground troops.
Oh, interesting.
He understood the risk of getting bogged down in a war that couldn't be won. Eisenhower had seen the devastating consequences of prolonged conflict and was wary of repeating those mistakes.
And then you have Kennedy increasing involvement but not fully committing. As the lecture describes it, he seemed to be testing the waters, which ultimately left a lot of unresolved issues.
It was a delicate balancing act, trying to support South Vietnam without getting drawn into a full-blown war. And as the lecture portrays him, Johnson really exemplifies this Quagmire concept. Each step he took deeper into the conflict made it harder to extricate the U.S.
It's like he got caught in a current and couldn't swim back upstream.
It's a powerful analogy for understanding how a series of seemingly small decisions can lead to unintended consequences. And Johnson seems to have been trapped by those consequences.
Yeah. So it sounds like just from this first category,
Right.
I'm sorry, the first group of topics that we've gone over, I mean, it's already so complicated.
It is.
Like, how do you even begin to tease these things apart?
Right.
Like, I mean, I guess that's what we're doing here, but
yeah.
it's going to be tough.
It is a challenge. But I think by breaking it down systematically like this, we can start to see the different threats and how they intertwine.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember, too, that we're talking about real people here, making decisions with imperfect information in incredibly complex circumstances.
Sure.
So there's no easy answers.
Yeah.
And it's not about judging them with the benefit of hindsight.
Right.
It's about trying to understand their perspective and the pressures they were facing.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes history so fascinating. It's not just a bunch of dates and facts. It's about human beings grappling with difficult choices and the consequences of those choices.
Well said. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground already, but there's still much more to explore. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve into some specific examples from the lecture to illustrate these concepts in action.
Okay.
So stay tuned, and we'll be right back.
Sounds good. It's a cautionary tale about the slippery slope of escalation. So, after examining these 6 categories from the lecture, it's clear that there wasn't one single reason the U.S. got entangled in Vietnam.
Yeah, it really was this tangled web of ideology, domestic politics, economics, global strategy, and alliances, plus that whole Quagmire concept, how one step can lead to another, and before you know it, you're in way deeper than you ever intended.
It's fascinating how these different factors interacted and influenced each other. It wasn't a simple case of cause and effect, but more like a complex system where all these elements were constantly pushing and pulling.
And the lecture really focuses on these 3 presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. But even their motivations and approaches weren't static. They were constantly evolving.
Absolutely. The lecture points out how Eisenhower initially resisted committing ground troops, yet he laid the groundwork for deeper U.S. involvement. Then Kennedy came in with his focus on counterinsurgency, increasing the American presence but stopping short of full-blown war. And Johnson, well, he dramatically escalated the conflict driven by that fear of losing and the potential damage to U.S. credibility.
It's almost like each president was facing a different version of the same problem, with the stakes getting higher and the options seemingly narrower with each administration.
And remember, they were all operating within this larger Cold War context where every decision had to be weighed against the global struggle against communism. It really puts their choices into perspective.
It's mind-boggling when you think about the weight of those decisions.
Yeah.
So based on this lecture, what would you say were the most significant factors that led to such deep U.S. involvement in Vietnam?
That's a tough question because, as we've discussed, it was such a multifaceted situation. But if I had to pinpoint a few key factors, I'd say the Domino Theory. That fear of communism spreading throughout Southeast Asia was incredibly influential. It really framed how U.S. policymakers viewed the entire conflict.
It sounds like that fear wasn't just limited to government circles. It was pervasive among the American public as well.
Exactly. And then you had the domestic political pressures, the Red Scare McCarthyism, that intense pressure on presidents to appear tough on communism. They were constantly caught between what they thought was best for the country and what they needed to do to maintain their own political standing.
It's almost like they were trapped trapped in a no-win situation.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the whole issue of international credibility. The U.S. couldn't afford to be seen as backing down from a challenge, especially by the Soviet Union.
The Vietnam War became a proxy war in many ways, a testing ground for the two superpowers. And the U.S. felt this responsibility to demonstrate its strength and resolve to allies around the world.
So it sounds like U.S. involvement was driven by a combination of fear, ideology, and global strategy.
I think that's a pretty accurate assessment. It was a complex interplay of factors, each feeding into the other and ultimately leading to a long and costly conflict.
It really makes you appreciate how history isn't just a series of events, but a web of interconnected decisions and forces.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of understanding the context in which these events unfold. If you only look at the surface, you miss all the nuances and complexities that truly shape the course of history.
Well said. You know what strikes me as missing from this whole discussion, though? We've been so focused on the U.S. perspective, but what about the Vietnamese people?
That's a crucial point. We've been analyzing the motivations and actions of the U.S. government, but we can't forget the profound impact this war had on millions of Vietnamese lives.
Right. We've talked about the domino theory and the fear of communism spreading, but what about the people actually living through this conflict? What were their experiences, their motivations?
It's easy to get caught up in the grand narratives of history, the political maneuvering, the ideological battles. But it's crucial to remember that these events played out in the lives of real people.
The lecture gave us a solid framework for understanding the U.S. perspective. But I think it's important to acknowledge that there's another side to this story that needs further exploration.
I couldn't agree more. And that's the beauty of history. It's full of layers and perspectives waiting to be uncovered. There's always more to learn, more to understand.
It's like we've been studying this incredibly detailed map of the terrain, but forgetting that there are actual people living on that land.
Exactly. Their experiences, motivations, and perspectives are just as important to understanding this conflict.
So where do we go from here? We've got this great foundation from the lecture, but now I feel like we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah. I think the next step is to delve deeper into the Vietnamese perspective, to explore their history, culture, hopes, and fears, and how those shaped their choices during the war.
It's like we need to zoom in on that map and see the individual villages' families, the stories that make up the larger narrative.
Precisely, we need to understand why the North Vietnamese fought so fiercely, why some South Vietnamese supported the U.S. while others joined the Viet Cong. What were their goals? What sacrifices did they make?
It's going to be fascinating to explore those different viewpoints. I have a feeling it'll challenge some of our assumptions and give us a much richer understanding of the war.
I think you're right. It's always eye-opening to step outside our own frame of reference and try to see the world through someone else's eyes.
It's like putting on a new pair of glasses and seeing everything in a whole new light.
Exactly. And I think it's essential to do that if we truly want to understand the Vietnam War, or any historical event for that matter.
Well said. I think we've accomplished our mission today. We've taken this dense lecture about U.S. involvement in Vietnam and extracted the key insights that will help you grasp the why behind it all.
And we've gone a step further by acknowledging that the U.S. perspective is only one piece of the puzzle. To truly understand this conflict, we need to explore the Vietnamese experience as well.
Exactly. We've laid the groundwork, but there's so much more to discover, and that's the beauty of it all. History is an ongoing conversation, a journey of exploration that never really ends.
It's a journey I'm always excited to be a part of.
Me too.
Yeah.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep digging deeper. You might be surprised at what you find.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.